The Improved Science of Politics and the Extended Republic, Lecture 1. So after several lectures on the basic contents of the Constitution itself, we now begin a series of lectures that are on the what you might call the design principles of the Constitution. So before we get to talking specifically about into more detail about Congress and the executive, the branches of government, I want to spend some time talking about some of the more famous Federalist Papers that get into some of the ideas that informed the overall design of the Constitution. And we begin with Federalist Papers 9 and 10, which are about what Madison refers to as the extended republic of the Union. And what he means by that is this: there had been partly on the basis, or I would say largely on the basis, of the influence of Montesquieu, there were a number of people that thought that the kind of federal government contemplated by the proposed Constitution would inevitably become a despotic or tyrannical form of government. And this was based upon Montesquieu's observations, among others, that very large and heavily populated countries can only be effectively governed by an absolute ruler who is unconstrained by the law. And the thinking was the more people you have to control and the more territory you have to sort of express force across in order to maintain order, the more you need a government that can act really quickly and really energetically, and that can act on the basis of judgment to deal with things. So you've got an emergency that comes up here, you've got something you've got to do over there. You need a central power that's not heavily constrained by rules, that can act quickly in response to situations. And that's a despotism. That's the paradigmatic example of a despotism was the Ottoman Empire. And so, unlike the individual states, if you considered the 13 newly independent states as a single union, you are dealing with what was at the time, both in terms of geography and population, one of the largest countries in the world. So some people thought, here's what Montesquieu says, here's the size of the United States. The kind of union you are contemplating is going to be a disaster. It's going to degenerate into a despotism. And as I said, there were a number of anti-federalists that made this one of the prime objections to the proposed Constitution. And in a way, the thinking behind that objection, influenced by Montesquieu and among others, the thinking behind that objection was part of what informed the Articles of Confederation. Because if you recall, with the Articles of Confederation, there was a union primarily for coordinating the state's activity with regard to foreign policy and war, because they recognized that in order to maintain their independence, they were going to have to form a united front in their relations with the outside world. But they tried to leave the domestic government up to the individual states. So the result of that with the Articles of Confederation was that the central government had very little coercive power. The states retained the power to draft. The states retained the power to enforce the laws. The states retained the power to tax. And in a certain way, the central government was almost like a coordinating committee that, it made regulations or laws, but it couldn't execute its own laws. And in fact, the national government under the Articles of Confederation was really just sort of a legislative committee. And then in overseeing the day-to-day functions, you would have a smaller executive committee. But there was no separate executive branch, and there was no judicial branch. So executive and judicial powers were exercised exclusively by the state governments within their own jurisdiction. And the thinking behind this was, if we give coercive power to a national government, if we actually create a full national government with the power to legislate and adjudicate and execute, then it's going to become so powerful in order to govern such a large country that it's going to turn into a despotism. So to preserve our own liberty, we want to keep powers in the hands of the states. That was the thinking. And so one of the main things that Madison, among others, had to do at the Constitutional Convention itself, and that Madison and Hamilton and the other Federalists had to do during the ratification debates, was convince their fellow citizens that not only was the proposed federal government in the proposed Constitution not a threat to liberty, but that in fact adopting the Constitution and having this more powerful federal government was actually better for the liberty of the people. That liberty will be more protected by a full and stronger central government. And this was obviously not necessarily going to be an easy case to make. So Federalists 9 and 10 are devoted to one aspect of that. I mean, really, if you look at the Federalist Papers as a whole, and I don't have you read that many Federalist Papers, but if you look at the Federalist Papers as a whole bunch of the early Federalist Papers are all dedicated to trying to prove to a skeptical audience that the preservation of the United States, the preservation of the liberty of Americans, required a more powerful central government than what existed under the Articles of Confederation. So there are lots of papers about this, addressing it from various considerations. Federalists 9 and 10 are about one specific aspect of this, and that has to do with the problem of faction, which Madison will give a definition to in Federalist 10. But in the most basic sense, by the problem of faction, you're talking about the problem of a society dividing up, becoming internally divided among hostile groups. And there are many examples of this. If you studied ancient politics, for example, as Madison points out, one of the prominent sources of faction in ancient Greece, and also really that kind of brought down the Roman Republic, was factional conflict between rich and poor, where instead of kind of working together with a general sense of common interest, you have a situation where the wealthy and the poor, the rich and the poor, become increasingly divided against one another. So that the poor are hostile to the rich and the rich are hostile to the poor. So class conflict would be an example of faction that they're talking about here. And if you read, say, Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, the factional conflict between rich and poor during the time of the Peloponnesian War in ancient Greece tore cities apart. Cities just devolved into vicious civil war. So class conflict can be one source of it. If you go to modern times, obviously one of the major sources of faction in modern Europe was religious divisions, the divisions between Catholics and Protestants, especially in the wake of the Reformation. As you probably know, there was almost unending war somewhere from the beginning of the Reformation until the Treaty of Westphalia in the 1640s. So religious differences caused societies to divide up into mutually hostile groups, and again devolved into massacres, persecution, civil war, the kind of stuff that Locke was trying to convince Europeans to avoid in the Letter Concerning Toleration. So class conflict, religious conflict. And another source, a less bloody source, but, within our own history, probably the biggest example of factional conflict is the conflict between North and South, primarily over the institution of slavery. So where the supposed union ends up dividing up into, kind of mutually hostile groups. A much less kind of dangerous, usually, version of faction would also be partisanship. The partisan conflict between, liberal and conservative, or really, between Democrat and Republican, and the way that Democrats and Republicans can come to see one another as kind of alien, hostile groups. So these are all examples of faction. And the key problem that that Madison and Hamilton are addressing is the fact that faction is especially a problem in any form of free government, in any form of government that Montesquieu would have characterized as a republic. And remember, for Montesquieu, a republic is kind of one of two things. By a republic, you could mean something like an ancient democracy such as Athens, where the citizens directly govern themselves, right? Because in ancient Athens, most major policy decisions were made by the citizens in an assembly. They did not have elected representatives. They had officers that oversaw the day-to-day functions of government. They had a few elected offices, such as general, for very important public tasks, but kind of for sort of ordinary day-to-day, for ordinary politics, kind of the big decisions the community had to make. They didn't have representative democracy. They governed directly, what's called assembly democracy. And that is what in Federalist 10, Madison defines as a democracy, where the people directly govern themselves. The example from American history would be the Puritan townships that Tocqueville talked about. The New England townships were directly self-governing. The proverbial town hall meetings was where most legislation and public business was conducted. And it wasn't through a medium of representatives. The citizens themselves would gather in the town hall and debate and make resolutions about matters of common concern and the public good. So a Puritan township would be an example on American soil of a democracy. But the more common use of the term republic, and this is how Montesquieu uses it, and also how Madison uses it, is a representative democracy. So in other words, one where the people are the ultimate sovereign, they're the ultimate source of authority, but the people don't directly do the governing. The actual governing of the country is done by representatives who are elected by the broader population. And that means they're accountable to the broader population. The politicians, so to speak, do the day-to-day governing, but periodically, every 2 years or every 4 years or every 6 years, they have to stand for re-election, at which point the people can remove them if they think they're doing a lousy job. So a republic is still a form of free government in the sense that it's still ultimately the people, or a sizable portion of the people, who constitute the sovereign authority. But it's just not direct democracy. And so one of the main problems that Hamilton and Madison are dealing with in Federalist 9 and 10 is the fact that faction, right, where society is divided into hostile groups, faction is an especially deadly problem for free government. Because if your society governs itself, then if there are major hostile divisions within the society, those very same hostile divisions will appear in the government, right? Like if the people are divided against one another and they meet in an assembly, then it's like two groups or multiple groups of enemies meeting in an assembly. Things get worse rather than better when the government assembles. But even if you have a representative democracy, since representatives are accountable to the people, the divisions that exist within society will be reproduced in the government itself. So the government cannot save a society from its own internal divisions. So if those divisions get bad enough, you're on the road to civil war, and your community is going to fall apart. This is not a problem in something like in a monarchy, or really even in an aristocracy as much, because in those societies most people aren't free, and the government's not accountable to the people. So even if the society is divided up into some hostile groups, it doesn't affect the government that much. The king, by and large, will do what he wants within the scope of his authorities, as will the aristocrats. So factions, because of the lack of freedom of the general population, even if there are divisions, they might never really be expressed because the people aren't free to mobilize around them. But even if they are expressed, they can be kind of violently repressed by the government. So faction is not especially a problem in aristocratic or monarchical forms of government. With one exception, factions within the aristocratic class can be a problem, but this isn't a class on aristocracy, so I'm not going to get into those details. You can read Aristotle's Politics, his book, if you want to learn more about that. So what all of this led to is that there are a number of people who argued that America's experiment with self-government was inevitably going to be a disaster. Because if you look at the history books, you see that free governments, however inspiring they might be, generally speaking, have very short lives and violent deaths. Right? Oftentimes the cause of death is faction. Either the city devolves into bloody civil war, or else faction causes a community to become so divided that it is unable to defend itself from outside aggression, and so it collapses and ends up being conquered by some more powerful emperor or monarch from outside. So one way or another, these free forms of government, because of the problems of faction, end up collapsing into violence and unfreedom. And so defenders of monarchy would say, well, just look at history. You'll see freedom doesn't work. Monarchy works. Monarchies last for centuries. No government is free from all problems. But if you want a form of government that works, you've got to go with something like aristocracy or monarchy. Republics might be glorious, but they're short-lived and they die violently. And so what Hamilton and Madison are arguing, especially Madison and Federalist Ten, is that in fact the particular character of the American Republic, namely that it is a federal republic, right, that extends over a large space and a large and diverse population. And that's what he means by extended. An extended republic meaning one that covers a lot of space and includes a lot of people, so includes a lot of regional diversity. An extended federal republic is actually the form of self-government that is most able to prevent the problems associated with faction. So if the problem of faction is the basis for your objection to free government, then Madison is going to argue that is not an objection to the proposed union under the Constitution, because when you understand the way that the country will work, you'll see that the federal government will actually be largely spared of any serious problems associated with factional divisions among the population. So that's going to be the argument. But I had you read a little bit of Federalist 9 first. And Federalist 9 is by Hamilton. He broaches the topic of the extended republic as a solution to the problem of faction, but he also talks more broadly about what he calls the new science of politics, or the improved science of politics. That's what I call it. So he starts in the first few paragraphs on pages 66 and 67 of this edition. He says, yeah, a lot of the opponents of free government trot out the problem of faction as a form of objection to any sort of free government. And then he says, and they paint a correct picture of the ancient republics, right? They're not making stuff up. They became factionally divided and eventually collapsed. And that's the way it is. So they're not making stuff up. And that's why he says, but he says, so if that's the best we could do, then this is a good objection. But it's not the best we can do, because in fact, as he says, the science of politics, the science of government has made improvements over time. So government, as it is practiced in the states and as it would be practiced by the federal government, is of a much higher quality than you found in the ancient world. And he gives some examples. This is on page 67, the first full paragraph, where he says, but it is not to be denied that the portraits that is the enemies of freedom, the portraits they have sketched of Republican government were too just copies of the originals from which they were taken. So in other words, they were right. They're not making stuff up. If it had been found impracticable to have devised models of a more perfect structure, the enlightened friends to liberty would have been obliged to abandon the cause of that species of government as indefensible. So in other words, if we weren't able to do better than the ancients, then free government is indefensible. And then he goes on, he says, the science of politics, however, like most other sciences, has received great improvement. The efficacy of various principles is now well understood, which were either not known at all or imperfectly known to the ancients. And now he's going to go on to talk about what some of these principles are that were either unknown in ancient times or not fully understood. And the thing that I want you to note is that except for the last one, the things that he named here are all things that come out of English politics. And they're all things that Montesquieu had singled out to talk about in Spirit of the Laws. They're things that that we talked about in the chapter on colonial heritage. So I'll read it, and as I go through, I'll kind of translate it into sort of contemporary terms. So he says, the regular distribution of power into distinct departments. In other words, the separation of powers, the separation of legislative, executive, and judicial power, and the way that protects against arbitrary government. That's the first one. Second one, the introduction of legislative balances and checks. Okay, so legislative balances and checks. And by that he means a couple things, primarily bicameralism. Remember how in England you had the House of Lords and you had the House of Commons. And for any law to be made, it had to pass through those two very different chambers. And that led to higher quality law. So as opposed to ancient assemblies, which oftentimes could act kind of quickly. This is one of the ones I would say that it was known, but known imperfectly, right? Because like Rome had a Senate and had assemblies and stuff like that. So this wasn't totally unknown. But what he means is that kind of bicameralism as a form of legislation, or as a method of legislation, has been perfected in modern times. Also, by legislative balances and checks, I think he has in mind the executive veto, giving the chief executive the power to veto legislation. And so especially that gives the executive the power to veto legislation where he believes the legislature is going beyond its proper scope of authority. So that's another check on arbitrary government. So that's the second one. Third one, the institution of courts composed of judges holding their offices during good behavior. That's what we would call an independent judiciary. Because if you want true rule of law, your judges need to be impartial. For your judges to be impartial, you need to make sure that neither the legislature nor the executive is capable of manipulating the judges. It's somehow threatening or bribing them to get them to render a crooked decision. And so the way you do that during good behavior basically means the judge serves as long as the judge wants to, and can't be removed for political reasons. So again, this is something that already existed in England, and it existed in the most of the state governments during kind of colonial and independence times. So in independent judiciary, so you've got separation of powers, bicameralism, independent judiciary. And the fourth one is the representation of the people in the legislature by deputies of their own election. So in other words, representative democracy. And obviously this, the primary precedent that he's thinking of here is the House of Commons in England, where you actually have a branch of the legislature that is accountable to a broader section of the people instead of just being aristocrats. So separation of powers, bicameralism and the veto, independent judiciary, representative legislatures. Those are four things that he says were either not known or imperfectly known, and that improve the quality of government. And you can see how kind of all of those things fit within the notion of rule of law that I was talking about in the colonial heritage lectures, that these are all means whereby government can be rendered both accountable to the people, but at the same time impartial in its functioning, that it functions by sort of coming up with general rules that are then impartially applied and reliably executed. And those were all things that they believed were kind of missing, that there was a lot more capacity for unruly and arbitrary government action, or even just hasty and stupid government action in the ancient world. And then the last one that he mentions, if you skip down about 8 lines, he says, is the enlargement of the orbit within which such systems are to revolve, either in respect to the dimensions of a single state or to the consolidation of several smaller states into one great confederacy. And this is the one that, by this, as he says, is what a lot of people on the grounds explained by Montesquieu objected to, namely, whoa, this proposed constitution contemplates a federal union that is very large and that has a full government, right? Not just a committee, but an actual government that can coercively enforce laws over this really large territory. It's going to be a despotism. Haven't you read your Montesquieu, right? That's the objection. And so what Hamilton is broaching here in this paragraph, and I didn't have you assign you anything beyond this paragraph, but what he's saying in this paragraph here is, in fact, this feature of the union, which you take to be an objection, its size, is in fact one of the things that most recommends it, that most ensures that the federal government will be of high quality and not prone to faction. And so that's what Madison argues in detail in Federalist 10, drawing on an argument that he had already formulated and delivered at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. So in the next lecture, we'll get to Federalist 10.